And so we now invite our seminarian, Marta Rivera, to offer us the sermon for this morning. Marta.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am really glad to get the chance to speak with you again this morning, and much gratitude to all the people who have made the technology possible to make this happen. And I'm especially glad to speak to you today because I think it's an important day. You might not think it's an important day, and that's okay, but I look forward to it. Today is the day in the lectionary that I call Table Flipping Sunday. This is Angry Jesus Sunday. This is Love Your Neighbor and Some Things Cannot Be Tolerated Sunday. This is Stand Up for What You Believe in Sunday. So before I talk a little bit about the background to this scene in the temple, I want to plant a question. What would you overturn tables for? Think about it. I'm coming back to it. But first, a little background. Who was in the temple and what were they doing? The commonly accepted explanation for who these money changers were and why there were sheep and cattle there is this. People made pilgrimages to the temple to offer sacrifice and to pay their temple tax, which was the money that allowed the temple to continue to function. Sacrifice animals had to be young and blemishless, and a little industry grew up around procuring and selling sacrificable animals to the people who came to the temple. Likewise, the temple tax could only be paid in a certain currency, and Jews would come from far and wide to pay the tax and sacrifice at the temple, and they needed to change their money into accepted local currency. So why drive out the animals and overturn the tables? Well, one of the things we see over and over in the life of Christ is how strongly he feels about places where cultural traditions, not religious traditions, cultural traditions have calcified in such a way as to rob religious acts of their true significance. For example, several times, Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, and the religious authorities criticize him for doing work on a day of rest. In Matthew, he will reply, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." So what is Jesus angry about here? He states, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." And that word marketplace is sort of interesting. In the Greek, it's a house of trading or exchange, and the word is emporiou, which, as you can probably hear, is where we get the English word emporium. So it does seem a little incongruous, temple as emporium. So what do we make of this scene? Now, the 2nd century commentator Origen of Alexandria thought this passage was a metaphor for the soul of a person being cleansed from its attachment to earthly things. And this metaphorical interpretation recurs a fair bit in the history of the interpretation of this passage. And honestly, I don't find it a bad one. Several other times, Jesus will note that attachment to earthly things, rather than the things of God, is a stumbling block to our relationship with God. However, other interpretations are more common now. One of the most common, and the one I remember learning, was that Jesus was offended at the mere presence of mercantile transactions in the temple. But the contemporary commentator, William Herzog, suggests that this is projecting backwards a sense of religion that would be foreign to the ancient world. If sacrifice was required at the temple, and we know it was, then all of the support services required to make sacrifices would also have been normal and likely non-controversial. It would be sort of illogical for a religion to set up a requirement for sacrifice or the temple tax and then make it excessively difficult to fulfill. This interpretation also, I think, if we follow it to its semi-logical conclusion, might suggest that pledging to the church or putting money in the plate on Sunday for the support of the community is also a problem. Maybe this is why this reading doesn't come around on Pledge Sundays. So It would seem that there would have to be something more than just the mere presence of trade to inspire this level of anger. Herzog also offers an interpretation that was new to me, but which I find quite compelling. Because of the temple tax, the temple was a very wealthy institution. Both the priestly families and the lay aristocracy that surrounded the temple controlled a great deal of money. Put another way, Herzog writes, the temple cleansing cannot be divorced from the role of the temple as a bank. The temple, either from its own treasury or on behalf of wealthy aristocrats, loaned money to the poor who were gradually falling deeper into debt, what we might now call predatory lending. They targeted peasants who were on the verge of losing their land, or we might now call foreclosure, while the rich, instead, were investing money to make yet more money, which we might call shareholder dividends at the risk of also projecting too much of modern economics backwards. Herzog highlights that during this time, income inequality was growing, the relationships between debtors and creditors were breaking down, and the consolidation of wealth to the affluent few in society was causing increasing problems. He concludes that it seems like it was no accident that one of the first acts in the first Jewish revolt of 66 CE was the burning of the debt records in the archives in Jerusalem. In this interpretation, Jesus's action was closer to Occupy Wall Street than it was to Origen's spiritual purification. So these are some ideas about why Jesus was motivated to overturn tables. At this point, I want to pause for a moment before moving into the question I started with, when we might overturn tables, because I feel compelled to note something else important about the history of the interpretation of this practice, of this passage. From the time of St. Augustine, this passage has been used to justify some truly horrific acts of violence by Christians. While the earliest Christians maintained that Jesus was absolutely nonviolent when it came to people, note that he drives out the animals and he overturns the tables of the people. This passage has been used, among other things, to justify the Crusades and a range of violence against people with ideological differences. Now, I believe that violence against those who disagree with you is not only wrong on the face of it, but also a terrible misinterpretation of this passage. I bring it up, though, because it is important that we confront the good and the bad in the history of Christian thought. And remember that when would you turn over tables is not the same question as when would you commit violence against other people. Now, regardless of which interpretation we adopt about what was the wrong being done in the courtyard of the temple, I think we can agree that Jesus is passionately and angrily standing up against what he sees as wrong. And I will say it out loud, I relish it. This is the Jesus that reminds us that being demure, retiring, mild, going along to get along, these are not absolute Christian values. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Yes, and sometimes you have to overturn some tables. In honor of Table Flipping Sunday, I'm going to do something I have never before done in a homily. I'm going to quote some random person from the internet. Because sometimes someone reconfigures a thing in just a way to make it hit in a new way. So on Twitter, I recently read, "Ancestors, forgive me for the times I desired a seat at a table you would have flipped." I think that our Twitter user has given us a remarkably good framework for judging our actions. When do we want a seat at the table? And when is it time to flip the table over? Jesus gives us examples of seats at the table. We know that Jesus sat at table with friends. We know that Jesus sat at table with outcasts and sinners, people with no power, the marginalized of society. We also know that Jesus sat at table with tax collectors and Pharisees, people with significant power. So when do we try for a seat at the table? And when do we flip over the table? So here we are. What would you flip a table for? For injustice, dishonesty, corruption, exploitation, to save a life, to save a soul? Most people who are hearing me now are watching via Facebook. So I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to ask you to take a moment and think about this question, and then write something into the comments. What tables do you see that need flipping over? Anything is fine. Where is injustice so pervasive that sitting with those in power at the table is not going to cut it? What needs shaking up so badly that you are not afraid anymore of the clatter of coins falling to the floor, that you would use your body to create change? What drives you out into the streets and the courtyards in protest? What will you flip a table for?